I'm here with two amazing guests who join me in tackling the question of how best to implement innovation in large enterprises, and also how maybe get some best practices on the ground for you to, as a startup, act when trying to secure a big corporation as a client. Joining me is Natalie Mano. Natalie, thanks so much for joining. Natalie is a leading executive at PepsiCo, specializing in global innovation and venturing. She's currently the GM at PepsiCo Labs, where she partners with startups and leads strategic innovation initiatives for the company. She brings deep expertise in the intersection of innovation, strategy, and venture investment. Prior to PepsiCo, you were an M&A and high-tech lawyer and worked for venture capital. Natalie is recognized for her leadership in building bridges between global enterprises, venture capital, and the startup ecosystem. Thank you so much for joining, Natalie.
Thank you, Klara, for having me.
Also joining is Spencer Penn. Spencer, you're the CEO of LightSource, leading procurement AI company headquartered in San Francisco, also exhibited here at DPW in case you have not checked them out. Previously, Spencer was a leader at Tesla, where he helped launch the Model 3 program, Tesla's first mass EV, and at Waymo for the Google self-driving car program, where he led the simulation org. Spencer holds an MBA and Master in Computer Science from Harvard, as well as BS from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He was also awarded the Forbes 30 Under 30 distinction for entrepreneurship in 2016. You can see I need to read this out. All this.
This is a full resume.
You look so young for all this.
To be fair, I'm over 30 now. They never strip you of that accolade, you know.
Okay. So he speaks regularly on topics of supply chain, manufacturing, robotics, autonomy, and artificial intelligence. Thank you so much for being part
of course. Excited for the conversation. Thank you, Klara.
So let me start off with some stats I looked into when prepping for this podcast, which really, really shocked me and showcases a little bit the urgency of discussing this topic. Okay. First of all, there was PwC did a big global CEO survey, and they find that 45% of the CEOs that were taking part in this global survey believe that their company will not be viable in 10 years if it stays on its current course. At the same time, in Germany, I'm German, so that's why I looked at the stats particularly for Germany, only around 5% of all German companies with a turnover of over 50 million actually do work with innovative startups. That's something we need to change. So the first question I would have is, how can we try to get innovation into the large enterprises in a quicker way for the benefits of both sides, right? Maybe starting with you, Spencer. At LightSource, you've been able to secure super interesting and renowned companies as customers, like Bombardier, Yum, who's the holding company for Taco Bell, KFC, Pizza Hut, as well as, funny enough, you mentioned Shure was one of your clients, which is the producer of this mic. So I'm sure there's a lot of success that was in your path at LightSource, but for sure you also have encountered some hurdles, so maybe you can share some of the biggest challenges you have faced trying to get innovation into some of these companies.
It's a really good question, and this is such a fascinating topic for me, and it's something that I live sort of every day. We've had roses and thorns working with enterprises, just like you would at any size of company. The places where we find the most success are organizations where you either have an autonomous innovation group, something similar actually to what Natalie runs, where there's a direct mandate and incentive to bring innovation into the business. Because you think about incentives, I feel that incentives drive behavior. That's just my perspective. And so if staying the course is the lowest risk thing that you can do, and there's not an immediate obvious performance bonus for upside of doing something that's more dangerous, that's more risky, that's more new, then you won't find people who really advocate or champion new technology. And so I find that actually having these innovation groups is extremely, extremely helpful. The other place where, at least in our business, we find a lot of pull is when companies are competing to launch new products faster, because in those moments, the volume of sourcing, supplier interaction, RFX activity, it's not just mowing the grass, it's not just general hygiene, it's actually a really intense period of work with suppliers. And so the pain of not having a solution is really high. And those are the places where when people feel like real pain in their current work, they're looking for a solution, and they will put their careers on the line, they will take risks, they will look for something that can really work, they will bet on a startup if they have something that can really solve an immediate pain point that they're facing. So those are the two places where I've found at least the most opportunity. And then of course, you have all the normal challenges working with an organization. You have the different stakeholders in the buying council. You have the procurement team that says, oh, we love LightSource, we really want LightSource. You have the IT team that might say, but don't we have something we've built already at home, or don't we have a larger system like SAP? Can't that check the box, even though people might be complaining for decades about it? You have finance that needs to be educated about the value of investing in procurement. So organizational, political challenges are always hard. And then maybe the final thing I'll just sort of add on this is that nobody wants to ever indict their previous work. And so if you have someone who's been in the seat for a long time, they brought in the solution that's there today, they don't want to look at new solutions as a replacement. There's exceptions always, but it really depends. But I'm honestly not the expert of this. Natalie probably is more so than I am.
So happy to chime in here. I think that some of the challenges, or what we're seeing at PepsiCo, it's twofold, right? It's pre-pilot, and then it's first deciding on whether we want to start engaging with the company, and then it's once we decide we do, on all the organizational hurdles that go into setting it up, right? So the first part, and you touched on this, and for us it's critical, it's touching on a business use case that's critical for our stakeholders, right? If that's not the first thing that we're aligned to, then any meeting with a startup is candidly irrelevant, right? Because we need to be solving for a critical problem that has a clear ROI and that's bringing impact to the business, right? And maybe I'll touch a little bit later on our operating model and how we work with our digital transformation leaders and with the business, but we're seeing that a lot, right? So it's first and foremost understanding what we're solving, how we're doing that, and is this the right company to do that, right? We do a very extensive competitive mapping to make sure that we have a very good hold on the market. So sometimes that's also a complex area, that when the market is starting to be so full of new companies, and with agentic AI and new AI solutions, certain things are starting to look like table stakes. And to your point, right, the second phase, which sometimes is also the first one, is really understanding our current tech stack and how new solutions will fit in. Are we solving for a white space? Are we bringing something that's truly incremental to what we currently have? And then it's working through procurement, InfoSec, legal, and everything else to get the pilots in place.
Very interesting. Thank you. So let's maybe deep dive into what you just said. I'm sure there's a lot of startups listening in as well. So what happens after a first meeting in PepsiCo? If a startup is there pitching, doing a good conversation, really like having a nice innovation, what happens next?
Yes. So I think maybe it's worth talking a little bit about the model at PepsiCo Labs and how we operate across the business. So PepsiCo Labs is essentially the tech venturing and innovation arm for PepsiCo. What we do is we work with the different functions, procurement of course being one of them, to first and foremost understand the business needs. So it's essentially in-depth strategy work. We're part of the strategy and transformation team to really understand the pain points, what they're doing, how they're doing, what's working and what's not. And only after we have a very clear briefing and understanding of that, we start to scout and meet for solutions. So we're very focused on the problem to solve, like I mentioned earlier, and then we start looking and meeting with companies. So we scout externally, we have a lot of venture capital partners, we come to conferences like DPW to make sure that we have good reference on new companies that are also emerging, and then we start meeting with companies, right, after we know what we want. And at this point, I think it goes back to my earlier comment, right? We do the first meetings, we understand that there's a viable solution here, that technology works, that they have traction with other customers, or that we want to co-develop with them a new solution that we're seeing as a white space for us. And we start to work internally with our stakeholders to really get them engaged and understand now which use cases, even within the solution, we want to try and test out. Right, so we do that first round of filtering and then bring it to our business stakeholders and transformation leaders as well to meet with the companies. And once there's a decision to pilot, then we go through the corporate, let's call it red tape, that we need to do in order to get a pilot up and running.
Okay, super interesting. That plays a little bit into what you said, I think, Spencer, on how it's sometimes challenging to find the right champions to really push forward. What's your experience with pilots and the outcomes of these kind of, time and expense heavy like project steps? Mm-hmm.
So I think finding a really credible champion is extremely important, and these people are essential and frankly beloved to me in the companies that we work with, because they're folks who I think beyond just doing their day-to-day job have a desire to really improve their company. It feels like a very virtuous kind of thing. Now, with pilots, I think they're a double-edged sword, frankly. And I understand from the corporate perspective that folks feel like, hey, look, we need to test this out. We need to see if is this all hat, no cattle, or do they really bring the goods? And then also there's a question of how does this fit, not just as a technology demo, but how does it work within the organization? What's the adoption look like? In our case, how do the suppliers react to using it? There's all sorts of questions that I think you want to figure out, but pilots are very expensive. We have to basically do effectively an implementation. There's no quick and easy way to actually get the true experience if you want a real use case in a real production setting. And so you end up, and then there's another thing, which is that a lot of times companies don't really want to pay for it. They say, hey, we're just testing, this is an opportunity to sell to us. And then what ends up happening is you have the most well-resourced companies in the world asking for free services from the companies that are really trying to build up their brand from the ground up. Now we're in the luxurious position now that we don't actually need to run pilots anymore. We have enough folks that believe the solution is credible that very often we've now just said, hey, look, there's two options. You can either do an on-site workshop for 2 days and then make a purchase decision, or you can get a 1-year license, and that is effectively doing a pilot. 6 months later, we'll have a renewal conversation for a 3 or 5 year contract. But I've also seen pilots work. You can prove value, but it's extremely important to understand upfront, if we do this pilot, what happens next. And so one of the failure modes I've seen of pilots is that sometimes people will fall back onto a pilot in lieu of a contract because they didn't get the budget or the staying power or the executive alignment or the champion. It's a lower bar, but what they're actually doing is they have to pay the piper 6 months down the line when they put in all this effort. And so if anything, I feel more so than ever, it's really important that if you're going to enter a pilot situation, you have a clear path to a bit of I would call it almost a charter. Hey, if we deliver in this way and these results stand, is there a production agreement at the end of it? Otherwise, it's just very, very expensive and painful and frankly demoralizing for the teams,
Spencer, happy to chime in here. I think that you touch on a great point here, right? For us, when we start going and we go into a pilot, we also want to understand what the path to success looks like. And by the way, we as innovation teams are not the budget owners, right? If there's no budget owner within the business who's accountable also for the pilot cost, but also for implementation cost, then we don't go into this, right? Because we know that that's part of their commitment to it. So that's why we also always push on, okay, what's the budget for the pilot? But then also what would be the budget for full implementation? And by the way, that's sometimes a little bit of a struggle working with certain companies that they don't want to promise a certain a cost for their solution. And I understand there's many variables, but for us, by the way, that's something that we try to think a lot through prior to going into a new pilot with a company. But for us, we're still in the phase that we feel more comfortable because it's such a big responsibility. So before entering a full agreement, we always test solution. And so by the way, we also test sometimes 2 companies side by side. We pay both of them. We don't get many free pilots, but still we see a lot of value in that as well. If you're doing a side by side, I think it's also, you're pushing the companies to deliver better results because you're saying, we're giving you fair chance. You have 2 companies that are potentially delivering a very similar solution. Now it's also on you to deliver the business value and outcome that you're committing to.
It's totally true. And just as a quick disclaimer, I think Natalie and the PepsiCo team is an example of a good company doing this really effectively. So I just want to make it clear, I'm just talking about the myriad. I interact with thousands of enterprises, and so I've seen everything at this point. But I think even just simply the fact that there is a team that is dedicated to bringing innovation in and is thinking about best practice is already 3 standard deviations above the norm. So I just want to make that clear. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And love the idea of having a pilot being financed by the business unit to make them understand if you're not even finding the money to do the pilot, we can be sure that implementation is potentially not happening. Right?
And it's also resources. It's not only paying for it. It's that level of commitment where you put time, you put effort, you put your best talent. It's a lot of effort also from the corporate to get a pilot up and running, not only from the startup, right? From the startup's perspective, it's, hey, we need to put so much effort, but that's their business line. For us, this could be sometimes an incremental value. This could be an add-on. This could be a new workflow, right? Not everything is necessarily ripping and replacing a huge platform, but there's still a lot of value in that and business value that we can see ROI. But there's also a level of commitment that goes into it and prioritization, right? We as an organization can't go for everything, even if we find exceptional technology and exceptional companies. At the end of the day, we will need to prioritize, and we also don't want to create a tool fatigue, right? We want to make sure that the things that we're bringing in are bringing true value, because we're not looking for, let's call it, new shiny toys, but we're looking for business impact, right? And if it's with a startup, then great. If it's with a big a grown-up or a corporate, then also great, right? The mandate is to really elevate our organization and do what's best for us, so that we always take that into account as well.
So learning so much already on best practices from corporate side, loving it. Let's pretend you're facing a customer, Spencer, that does unfortunately not have such a great innovative team around trying to push innovation into the company. How have you experienced, like good experience in tackling this? What would be a tip to make a sale even though you don't have an innovation team at your side?
And now this is specific to the enterprise, to large cap businesses.
Yeah.
I would find a specific division. So a lot of times you can't eat the elephant in one bite, right? And so for us, we work with big three automotive companies in the United States, and that's become one of our hallmark kind of customers, although we can't talk about all their logos publicly. And the way that we entered Big Three Auto, everyone says it's so hard to sell to that company. It's a decade of whining and dining, which is something I never do. But they had a specific division that was focused on developing next generation EV vehicles. And that team had a separate line directly to the CEO. They were tasked to sort of disrupt the core business in a way, and had a lot of agency over their own tools. And so a lot of times what you'll find in these large organizations is they might have a sort of blanket system that is the general backbone ERP across the organization. It kind of checks a lot of boxes, nobody's in love with it, and then there's really deep pockets of pain in specific areas. And so finding who's the champion who's willing to put their hand up in the air and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this, and it would be a huge unlock for me if I could figure out a way to solve it. And then you can get into a business line that's maybe 1,000 people instead of trying to sell initially to a 100,000 person org. And then in that way, you can think of large corporates sometimes as a holding company for 50 smaller business units. And at that point, when you break it down, you can actually get in at one of those entry points. And then once you're actually working with the company and you're already an approved vendor, you're on PO, you've done InfoSec, people trust you, you have internal case studies, that's way more powerful than, hey, we did something for a different company you don't know anything about. Then you can actually start to expand. And that they call that land and expand. That's the classic term in Silicon Valley. And I do think that still works really well.
I agree.
Cool.
Have you experienced that in Pepsi as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the preliminary stages, I think a few things, and Spencer, you do this actually very well, is A, understanding your market and your competition really, really well. Because you're coming into this, let's say, whether it's an RFP or whether it's in conversations to getting a pilot up and running, you really need to show how you're differentiated from others in the market and what makes you unique and why we should pilot with you. I think the second thing is also having a very clear let's say, playbook for how a pilot should look, right? At the end of the day, we're expecting our partners to know how implementation looks, to know how to work with a big enterprise, to know exactly what's expected of us in terms of time, resources, anything that goes into a pilot setup. We want our partners to be informing us how that's going to look. That's the second thing. And I think after that, we just really want to have good partners at the end of the day to work with, right? So it's a partnership for the long term. Yeah.
And I'll just build on this really quickly. one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got from one of our board members after we talked about, and I would say for pilots, a lot of them close very successfully. We get them over the finish line. A lot of them, we can't quite get the momentum from the business afterwards. It's just natural that happens. But one of the best pieces of advice that I received was to think about the pilot as a product. And so a lot of times I think startups especially, and this is advice I would give to any startup that I advise, is you accidentally will start thinking of pilots as being a bespoke, custom prototype that you're going to construct with the customer for their specific thing. And then it ends up being very hard to do a good rinse and repeat motion. You can't really guide them through the process. You can't instruct them well. You don't have standard ways of measuring. You deploy way more resources. So if you think about, hey, if someone comes to me today and says, hey, how do we pilot LightSource? There's a SKU, there's a box. This is how you do it. These are the two options you have. Option A or option B, you can choose either one. But it's not, that's a great question, let's figure it out. What do you have? Who's involved? You have to come in with a very clear view of the pilot as a product, and that's sort of, I think, something that Natalie just said really reminded me of this.
But I think that's also knowing how to sell to enterprises, right? Because I think that's also the differentiation point between startups that sell from the get-go to large enterprises, or where they're starting, let's say, mid-market and gradually trying to evolve into enterprise customers, where you see a differentiation, right? And I think that's understanding the complexities of a corporate, and when you're focused on that from the beginning and really from day one, and you're building your product, you're building your sales team to cater to the enterprise, that's also a big differentiation point that we're seeing as well.
Absolutely. And look, and building on that, you mentioned mid-market going upstream to enterprise. Every size of business has its own roses and thorns, right? Benefits and drawbacks. I love selling to enterprise. People say it's hard, but there's also certain elements of it that are actually easier. You have a much larger expansion opportunity if you land. You have phenomenal professionals. You have people that were often, we'll find that there will be, instead of selling to IT, you're selling to procurement IT or supply chain IT, who are really aware of the area. And then small cap SMB, you end up with a very budget conscious customer, and they can sometimes take actually as long as a corporate to make a decision over a contract that's 100th the value. So, I think there's roses and thorns of every scale. I actually love selling to enterprise for that reason.
Once you're in, it's typically for the long run.
Hopefully.
Yeah, it's sticky business, right?
Yeah.
Super. Okay, I'm lucky because I have startup as well as large cap here. So I would ask one question. If you, Spencer, could change something of how enterprises get innovation going, what would you change? Let's pretend we're in fairy tale land.
So, fairy tale land. The first thing I would say is that I would want Natalie to be at every single Fortune 500 and Global 2000 business owner.
We would love that.
Yes, and they would too, because I think that an innovation group is really important. I just feel that people, again, they play to their incentives, and so in a large business, it's very rarely somebody's primary job to think about how do we innovate and bring technology into the fray. I've often thought that it would be really nice to see more upside, and personal upside. I've often felt, and maybe this is, controversial, but a bit of a disconnect between what's good for the business and what's good for the individual across many functions. And what's really good for the business, this is to your point originally, 45% of CEOs feel that their company is not going to exist, or is going to be way worse in 10 years. That's a shocking statistic, and it's actually true. Now, how do you end up in this very weird global minimum instead of a global maximum? It's that people look at it and they say, if I do nothing wrong, then I will be fine. And if I do something really innovative and great, I will either be in trouble because people are like, why are you shaking things up? Or if it goes really well, it's not clear that I'll be rewarded. I feel this all the time in procurement. If suppliers don't ship, I'm in trouble. You stop the line. If everything goes great, then people just expect it to happen like running water. And so I'd love to see in the procurement world incentives for people to drive better performance, and in the innovation world, if something really drives a huge outcome. I look at the sales world. If you go sell a $10 million contract, you're getting $1 million commission. If Natalie brings into her business a company that can actually drive $100 million of P&L impact, I would hope that they would be willing to give her that sort of eight-figure paycheck. But that's not the reality of the world that we live in. So, I think if there was more balanced personal incentives aligned with taking these risks and a little bit more protection around those groups, I think that would actually be the rising tide that raises all ships in this space. But that's just my personal opinion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just emphasizing what you said. I looked at I have a statistic for
another one.
To meet this. The statement that you just shared. So there was a study 2024 on comparing companies that do have innovation units and companies that don't. And the conversion rate from pilot to actual implementation is quite different. So the conversion rate where a company, a large corporation, has a venture clienting unit, innovation unit similar to you, Natalie, is 25% of the pilots become implemented as a product. While if you are a large corporation without an innovation unit, it's only 10%. So it's basically a 15% money spent without any real upside for anyone, right? So yeah, we want to avoid that for sure. So that's a good point for all the CPOs listening in to please take away and take home. CPO is high enough to be a strategic position in any company, so couldn't agree more, Spencer.
And by the way, we're seeing this more now. I think especially with the AI boom, there are more boards talking about what's our AI strategy, CEOs then asking what's our AI strategy, and then the way that flows down to the business units is that the C-suite at every unit will typically have their own consigliere that they say, hey, you're going to be the AI czar for my next year. Go figure out what is this thing and how is it going to impact us, and I want to have a story. And so you're finding these sort of first-time innovation leaders within these different business units. I think it's happening more and more. That's just a quick thought.
Yeah, let's stay in fairy tale land for 1 second more. So what would you wish be, Natalie, if you could wish every startup to have something that you're lacking still?
Wow. So I think I'll focus on a clear action plan. If I would say one thing, I think that's the most critical. Was a critical key to have if you're really working with a large enterprise, having a clear path to success, helping us build together what are the right KPIs, what are the right success metrics that you can really deliver, and then of course always don't overpromise and underdeliver. That's key because that really destroys trust, and that's even from the get-go when we're shaping the use cases, the KPIs, everything that goes into the partnership. And again, walking us through the path to mutual success.
Here's a question that I actually have for Natalie. A lot of times, I don't mean to represent all tech founders, but there's sometimes, people will point the finger at the corporate and say, the reason this pilot didn't convert is you couldn't get out of your own way or whatever it might be, and that's not always the case. I know that sometimes it's because of the startups themselves and their maturity. What are the things that you would say that startups have sometimes done wrong when there was a bona fide opportunity that they had and that they fumbled it for some reason,
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, sometimes I do want to take responsibility and say, okay, we're piloting things and then not all of the solutions can scale, and we don't go into every single pilot. We come with an intent to scale every pilot that we do, right, because we're putting a lot of resource. But we have seen times, and I think it's typically when we don't move forward, where the company is just candidly not delivering on the right KPIs, right? We go into every single pilot with a clear charter, KPIs and success metrics, and then they're just candidly not hitting on them, right? And if you're not delivering on the promise, then we won't move forward, right? Sometimes it can also fall on user experience, user engagement. Just the product is not sticky enough. We always are very much in contact with our business stakeholders and with the folks in the business who are testing the solutions. So they're our main stakeholders, and we need to cater to them. So that's a mutual relationship that's it's as important, if not more important, than our relationship with the startup, because we act as that bridge, right? And we need to make sure that we're on the one hand representing the startup, but on the other that we're catering to the business needs. So it always falls on that. But other than that, I think it's a mutual path for success.
Have you ever had an example of a time, and I don't want any company names, but just yes or no, where a startup has said that they have a capability, and then when you get into the weeds, it's just all smoke and mirrors?
I don't know if smoke and mirrors, but I think it's not as promising.
Not as promising.
We did try a solution once where we already had a solution in-house, And we did want to test a capability with a new external vendor because they promised that the value that they would bring would be much more significant and incremental to what we currently have, and we were very disappointed with the results.
I can understand that, yeah, of course. So what's more, okay, to ask one more question. When you're looking for innovations, what's more interesting to you? Radical improvements of an existing software platform or tool that you already have, or things that are truly like greenfield, new white space opportunities, like we've just never approached this topic before and there's no competition?
I want to say white spaces,
okay,
because that's more exciting, but inevitably with changes happening so quickly today, we're looking at both. But I think white spaces is also easier to enter, right? Because if you're always competing with already a working solution, then it's also harder to implement in the business, right? You're competing already. And if it's a totally new white space, then it's also much easier to sell.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. And then I guess I have a question for you, Klara.
Yeah.
You know, you work with startups as well, and you help them get access to corporations.
Yeah.
How do you do that? What's your path to actually... I'm flipping the script. I'm actually interviewing the moderator. That's my nature.
Please do. So we, at Rosberg Ventures, we work a lot with the portfolio companies underlying our fund investments, as you mentioned. And what we basically try to achieve is the awareness of what innovation is happening in Silicon Valley in Europe is so small. So there's basically a huge education gap in the size of the Atlantic Ocean. So most corporates that are based in Europe don't have the opportunity to see everything that's happening in Silicon Valley and what innovations arise from there. So we try to take on the position of the observer because we do invest in the US and then we can see what happens in Silicon Valley. And we basically try to bring the innovation back to Europe by visiting corporates, talking to them about what disrupts them, where do they see that technology is a topic that they need urgently to look at, and get into a conversation and highlight some startups that we see and we find could be very, very important to know or to get into business with. At the same time, a lot of Silicon Valley-based startups were just starting out. I mean, LightSource is already obviously farther along the journey, but just starting out, they would not have the opportunity to get into a conversation with a German telecom just by calling them, right? So a warm introduction to people from innovation units, to people being part of the CTO or CIO teams is very, very valuable in order to discuss technology peer-to-peer and see, is it worth a demo? Is it worth creating a pilot or not, right? And this is where we work at a lot because we just see so many things with the investments that we do in the US.
So question, is it easier for a US-based tech company to sell into Europe or for a European-based tech company to sell into the United States?
Oh, interesting question. I think much easier from the US into Europe just because ultimately also the large caps in Germany, even if it's SAP, who's like a big player, would still be aware of US competition. While I always feel US companies, but maybe Natalie, you can comment on that, would be more looking into the US market as a whole and only secondary be concerned about what happens outside the US. So I feel like we're still in everything culturally as well as everything else following the US path a lot in Europe. You're happy about that. So this is why I think, this way around. So I think we learned so many things about what startups can do better in order to get into business with large enterprises, what enterprises need to maybe change a little bit in order to make innovation get into their business as well. And I mean, innovation is not about two guys in a garage. We need to implement that we need to implement that stuff and have corporates really be able to get ready for the future. It's in both sides' interest, in my view. So thank you so much for the conversation. That was very insightful, and enjoy your stay at DPW. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Great conversation.